All right, so one of the teams I was recently supporting is working on this website for the stock market news business. So they got the entire continuous integration, continuous delivery, BDD pipeline set up and nailed. So they will basically the features go through smoothly through the system. And they got to the point where the website was pretty stable and working, and they started to actually working on the new features or enhancing the existing features on the website. And through that, they run one simple experiment that yielded very interesting results. And those results and experiment is something that I want to share with you today. So that experiment came through as part of implementing new feature that the business requested. So as any other news website, stock date market website have a search, right? So one of the core features on that website is that you can search for articles related to stock. And obviously, as on any other news website, you enter the company name or the interesting article, and then you see the results in terms of like list of articles there. The interesting thing about that particular domain is that the results that you get aren't necessarily related to the company that you entered in a way where not all of those articles are directly about the Barclays, for example, if you enter the Barclays into search query. Some of those articles are about other companies that are somehow related to the news cycle that went through the Barclays. So as part of the research and market research and customer interviews, they identified that there is an opportunity there to highlight even more data together with that search result. So they had acquired a contract with a data provider that allowed them to show the history of a stock market change for each individual company. So they looked at that and they said, well, the cool feature we can do in this regard is on the search results, we can pick up which company this article is about when you're searching for it, and we can show basically a stock graph next to each individual article related to this company, all right? Obviously, business immediately went to the team that I was working with and started explaining this feature. We're doing BDD, so naturally, the first thing that will happen somewhere in the delivery of this process is we will write scenario or a set of scenarios like this, right? And this scenario is pretty okay-ish. I think you can do better, but generally speaking, it ticks all the proper boxes of like of Cucumber or spec flow good practices. It doesn't talk about the UI. It's fairly high level, so it allows a flexibility around how are you going to implement this. There's a lot of good stuff around this. But there is an issue with this in regards to the problem that we're trying to solve. And the problem is that the data that we're trying to channel through those search results comes from this third-party API that the team never worked with before, right? So effectively, they're kind of deep into the complex domain where they're trying to fetch the data that they never interacted with. So obviously, the next question you ask is, when do we write this scenario? And the answer is, you don't write it from the day one, because you need to do a bit of research. You need to look into the API documentation. How do you fetch this data? Which authentication you use? So effectively, what you do is you run a spike, right? So the way you run this kind of a feature is you do a small spike at the beginning where you sift through the docs, write some sort of a spec, a high-level technical spec. Then you fit it into a conversation with a business where an engineer who did the spike communicates to the business, here's the limitations, here's the constraints of this, here's the kind of data we feed, let's write scenario together. And you write scenario together somewhere in the middle of this process, and then you go and implement this. Now, the team that I was working with got this whole thing down to science. It didn't take long. It was a couple of days' work, up to a week of actually going through the entire thing and implementing this. And they did this on multiple occasions before. The thing that concerned the team, though, is that they went through this process multiple occasions in different integrations across the website. And one of the things that they spotted is, inevitably, they do analysis, they have a conversation, they write it down as a spec, they start implementing it, and at the very end of the process, they find out that there was something wrong, right? Either during the implementation, during the actual starting of the doing of the functionality, they find out that something didn't quite match, API docs were lying, or maybe the functionality didn't quite match when you start implementing it. Maybe the performance wasn't been up to scratch. So teams started asking fundamental questions before implementing this or before even going into reading the docs. And the questions they started asking is, can we start doing earlier, right? There is this whole bunch or like first phase of the implementation of this where we learn how the API works, how the integration. And the question they started asking is, can we actually start doing something, writing some sort of a code before we even understood how the API works? And the more important question that they started asking is, can we actually shorten the feedback loop? Because although that feedback loop probably will take us 3 to 4 days, which is very good in terms of agile teams, that's still quite long. Can they actually get a feedback and communicate feedback and get an information and an insight from the business earlier? And all it boiled down into a simple position that the team decided to go on, explore. So they said, we want to experiment for this just on this particular feature, and the experiment is this. What if for this particular feature implementation, we will aim for feedback instead of completeness? Let me unpack it in a bit. So when you start working on the feature, when we write our scenarios, that scenario that I showed you at the beginning, what we optimize for is we're trying to describe a scenario from the perspective of the user that will use that feature. So we'll try to aim for, like, is this useful? Is it usable? How will person actually interact with the system, right? So we're actually aiming for completeness, or at least an end user will be able to integrate with this feature and use it. And what we said is, what if, instead of targeting that completeness and usability of the feature, we will first look at getting feedback? What if we assume that we're wrong about some particular parts of this feature? What is the smallest slice of functionality or the smallest possible scenario we can write, or the stupidest possible scenario we can write, that will generate enough feedback for us to proceed forward? So we decided to go with it. And obviously, this all wouldn't work if we're shortening the feedback loops and we're going with those stupid scenarios and each one of them takes 3 days, right? It only would work if we're cutting down our loops from 3 days overall feature to each of the individual iteration gets like us in under a day. So we started looking, what is the first thing we can do in a first day? And the thing that the team came up with in regards to this particular feature is, well, on the first day, we can probably get a raw stock data for a single company from the API. And they went out, because we're doing BDD, and wrote a scenario. And they wrote a scenario like this. When I browse the secret page, /hidden page q bark, then I should see the raw stock API response for bark. Super low level, super dirty scenario, but we don't care because what we're aiming for is to gain a feedback. What it effectively describes is that suddenly on this news website, there is a new page accessible only when you use like some secret cookie that when you get there and you provide as a Q parameter particular ticker code for a company, you get API JSON response dumped, right? And that's the scenario. So the team went on and implemented this, and it looks something like this at the end, right? So you go to this secret page under the website, and you get this whole JSON just dumped on you without even formatting, without anything. And they've done this. It took a couple of hours before the end of the day. They sat together with other engineers, and they started, okay, what we can learn from this? Well, obviously, one of the first things that they learned is, through doing this, they identified which endpoints they need to call, what is the authentication method they use, what is the authorization method they use, how does that third-party API works. More importantly, during that, they started putting all those endpoints, authentication methods into the code. Whereas in other instances, they would just document it in some Google Doc because it's a spike, or just remember the information. Right now, they actually encode it into the source code of a system they're building in form of this page. So the technical feedback there from the team immediately was, oh, we don't need to document as much because documentation right now lives in the code. So the information just skipped through the Google Doc or some sort of a technical specification straight from documentation API that the third party provided through the person's heads into the code. But the team wanted to push further, and they had a pretty good relationship with stakeholder team, and they had this whole continuous integration pipeline set up. So they wondered, what if we actually push that thing to staging? It's a hidden page, so nobody who doesn't know wouldn't notice. But what if we just actually deliver it to stage? And they pushed that page to stage, and they shared the link over Slack to product owner. And they didn't expect product owner to even care or look, but he did. And he opened that page, and he entered that Bark ticker code. And in half an hour, he came back to the team without being annoyed, but actually saying, hey, guys, that's actually more stock data than we expected. We expected there to just be like an information regarding the plot and data, but you have a lot of context around the opening rates, the actual last 21 days of trading. There is a lot of stuff there. Maybe it's not just the graph that we can show. What if we bring designer into this conversation right now and slightly adjust the design to show more information in the search results? And we did that, and in the next half an hour, we had this adjustment, right? So suddenly, design started evolving a day after like a very technical hard coding, right? So then obviously the next day is, cool, we have that thing. Designers are starting to work on the new on the new UI. Let's start integrating that raw data into search results. That's the second iteration. So we took the same scenario we already have, and we rewrote it, right? To kind of push us a bit further to the final implementation. Given there are 3 articles mentioned in Barclays, and each of those articles is linked to a random company, when I search for Barclays, again, on the secret search page, so we created a flag in a URL that you can use, and when you trigger that flag, that search results page suddenly starts pimping JSON underneath each of the articles, right? So it kind of looks like this when it's implemented. Again, didn't take long because we didn't format anything, didn't design anything. Again, the team did that. Tests are running locally. They talk with other engineers, and immediately they find out something. It's kind of slow. Like, when we just were talking with single company, that was fine, but now when we try to fetch multiple, it's very, very slow. So maybe it's not a good idea to actually provide the data for each company, technically. And then they did the same thing where they pushed it into staging and showed it to the product owner. And product owners started playing with search results, actually entering different queries and stuff. And he came back with, that's interesting. Not many articles will actually have the relevant stock data. The data API that we're fetching is very limited. So if we go with the original design, even with an iteration that we built on top of it, there will be many data points that are missing. So what if we take this technical feedback and business feedback into account and limit this wall into a single graph, where you just enter the Barclays at the top, and we just show the graph and the very extensible market data just about the Barclays at the very top. And then you still have those normal search results, right? And that's like at the end of day 2.5. We suddenly are incrementing and iterating on something that you would consider very technical with product owner and the designer. So obviously the last step is, okay, we're pretty comfortable with this, let's put it all together. And that's the point where we end up with something that stayed as the final scenario for this project, right? When I search for Barclays, then I should see its stock data above search results. The thing that you should spot is that the scenario that I showed you at the very beginning, which was preliminary scenario that you would produce when you just first heard about this feature, is completely different, right? The reason why we ended up with this scenario is a set of technical and business limitations and limitations of that third-party API that we discovered by doing this thing. And there is another way to discover it, is doing the whole thing for 3 days and then finding out that it's very slow and doesn't have enough data. So the team built it, designed the actual graph, put it all in place, deployed it to staging, pushed it to product owner, and the product owner's feedback this time was just, okay, drop hidden pages and just ship it. He didn't even look for too long because all the decisions, all the feedback was already incorporated. The design already happened. That point where you usually expect the most of the product owner feedback about the feature just before the shipping, and then a lot of changes going forward, that happened hours before, days. So one of the interesting outcomes of this process is that you usually, when you're working with new domains, you usually have this process where you read the documentation and you put all that knowledge and learning into your head for a couple of days. Maybe you document it, but usually it's just in your head. And then you dump it at some point into either Google document or into code. What started happening with this team on those kind of features is that they learned just a small piece of information and immediately push it into test. And then they start implementing the test, and that pushes that learning knowledge back into the code. And then at some point, they push it to product owner, and the product owner provides immediate feedback, and that cycle continues. And they started doing this process more often in other features because of how successful it was. And the product owners got very involved in those small iterations. And the team found out a couple of learnings out of this entire process through going through this. The first and the most important learning there was that there was a lot of technical, like JSON data response, literally no product owner cares about it. Well, we found out that many of them don't care about the structure of JSON response, but they care about the data that is there. We usually underestimate how much of a pain threshold our product owners have about technology. Remember, we're building software to help them with their problem. So they do care about what we do. Not to the extent we do care about technology, but they do want to care and understand what is happening there, sometimes even under the hood. Encoded learning increases knowledge sharing. What we also found out that when you work in those one-day increments and you push your knowledge immediately into the code, when one developer does this first increment in a day, and then just gets sick or goes to the conference, and another developer picks up, you don't need to relearn the same thing, or you don't need to scramble for that Google document somewhere that describes whatever learning was happening. It's all in the code base, it's all in the tests. All the learning immediately transferred in the source code so people know where to search for it and how to continue. So there's almost no downtime between switches, between different team members. Another finding is that this first scenario where we started was very technical, very low level, like something that everywhere would be considered a bad BDD practice. But what we find out is that the technical details of scenarios starts at a very high level, but then decreases the more you learn about the system and what needs to happen. The same way designers and the product owners understand more about how this feature should shape, scenarios evolve together. We also reduce time working on wrong design and a solution. And I believe what the team created is this system where we have not just living, but growing documentation, right? Documentation starts earlier and starts evolving. Those scenarios start from something very technical and evolve into something very businessy. And as with any other tool, I didn't try it in every context, but I bet it doesn't work in every context. So the only thing I can give you as a recommendation, if any of this is interesting, go back and just try it for a single feature, right? And the thing that I want you to try on a single feature is just break it down and try to aim for feedback instead of completeness. And if it works for you, that's brilliant. Thank you.